Hello and welcome to another episode of IDL, the business trailblazer podcast for seasoned innovators, rising disruptors, and inspiring leaders. I'm your host, Chris Britton, and today's bright business mind is Hugo Lu of Orchestra. Hugo is a leader in the data industry, leading Orchestra in revolutionizing how businesses manage their data. Hugo combines his deep knowledge of data engineering with a vision for simplifying data processes. So let's kick things off. A very warm welcome to the podcast, Hugo.
Hello.
So I've given you a very interesting introduction there. Do you want to actually explain a little bit more about all the abilities that you can bring to data and what Orchestra does?
Yeah, sure. So, for anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Hugo Lu. I'm the CEO and one of the founders of Orchestra. So, Orchestra is a unified control plane for data operations. It's a pretty powerful platform, and under the hood, what we're basically doing is we're orchestrating data pipelines and then giving data teams visibility into everything that's going on under there. We're solving a lot of problems that I guess those abilities you mentioned people are starting to have in an enterprise setting.
We've got a wide audience that would listen to this podcast. So just for the laymen who are tuning in and going, this is quite interesting. I've got a bit of a techie
Yeah,
background. I want to know more. What is a data pipeline? Why would someone be interested in trying to observe their data? What does that mean in English?
yeah, definitely. And I think we can zoom out even further, right? Something everybody would have heard about is AI, and it's probably pretty high on many people's agendas at the moment. However, in order for you to do AI, you have to have good data. So, a model is something that you use to power artificial intelligence, and it has to be trained on stuff, right? It's like when you grow up as a child, you read books, but if you don't read any decent textbooks, you're not going to know anything, right? So you can think of an AI
Mm.
model like that. So then the question then becomes, okay, well, how do we get all of this good data, right? If you're sort of living and working in an enterprise setting, that data can exist in all sorts of places, right? You've probably got sheets, you've probably got offline documents, maybe databases that exist in the cloud, databases that exist on premise, SaaS applications and whatnot, and it's incredibly disparate. So my background is in data engineering, and as a data engineer, our job is essentially to aggregate all of that disparate data into a single location. It's then to clean it, so to sort of make it useful, right? Often this stuff is unformatted and very hard to work with, right? You can imagine we've all seen
Sure.
things like Google Sheets, which we would rather not ever see again. And then essentially, provide that information to end stakeholders in a format that's useful. So obviously at the high tech end, that's using it to power something like AI. But for many businesses, sometimes you just want to answer basic questions. So that sometimes comes in the form of ad hoc analysis. Maybe building a dashboard. Maybe doing a little bit of machine learning. But that's normally the goal. And it obviously gets very complicated in an enterprise setting, right? It's like you can build a
Mhm.
very basic data pipeline that's just a single script, but that is not something which is scalable. That is not something which works when you're dealing in organizations with thousands of people and sort of, hundreds and hundreds of different forms of data. So what Orchestra does is it knits everything together. You know, when you build
Mhm.
data pipelines, you need different pieces of infrastructure that do different things. And aside from integrating all of those pieces together, what's also really key is to have visibility over everything that's actually happening, right? Because if stuff
Yeah.
fails, right, you don't want to send reports to your CEO. You don't want to start doing this incredibly expensive AI model training, if the data's not right. And essentially building that system of governance, integrating all of those platforms, having sort of one place where anybody, business, data engineer, or otherwise, can go in and see and say, yes, my dashboard depends on these sets of data and everything's great. Or, actually, my dashboard's looking a bit funky today. Okay, here's why. Right, okay, Bob in
Mhm.
finance has screwed up the reports. I need to go and speak to him and fix that, right? Building that system yourself is an enormous, enormous, enormous endeavor for any
Mhm.
company of any scale. And that is what Orchestra does at a very high level.
And so how did you go about finding the gap in the market? When did it become apparent to you as a data engineer? Wind the clock back and think back to your early days when you started the business.
Yeah.
How was it born out frustration, or where did this all kind of
Yeah,
form from?
very much, very much. I think the sort of origin story for me in Orchestra is fairly standard. It's like I was working in a company called Jewel, like one of the fastest companies to ever get to a $10 billion valuation, enormous FMCG company, and lots and
Also quite
lots.
divisive as a company brand, if people
Very,
don't know
yeah,
Jewel
very
that well.
divisive,
So
very divisive.
yeah,
They make vapes for anyone who's unfamiliar. But
yeah.
long
The
story short,
ethicalities behind it, who their
yeah,
target market is questionable. But we won't go down that route today. We won't go into the marketing angle of that. Sorry,
yeah.
I digress. Go on.
Well, I mean, look, the problem that they had there from the architecture perspective, right, was the data is very messy, coming from many different sources, right, distributors across multiple European countries, terribly formatted. So the lift you had to do as a sort of platform engineering team was very high. And as I
Mhm,
sort of continue through my career, the sort of problem is the same, right? It's like you need to integrate all of the tools you've got into a system that's really, really, really resilient. And yes, it basically became a question of curing my own itch, because I found myself doing the same things again and again in every job. And obviously, one of the first
got
things
you.
you do when you start a company is you try to externally validate something you suspect is true, and you do this by
Yep.
speaking to people. So I've probably spoken to thousands of data engineers, analytics engineers, enterprise architects about what the issues they have are. And they're all spending their time in exactly the same way, which is integrating the different tools, which do their job exceptionally well, right? Tools you would have heard of as the
Hmm.
modern data stack. And
Hmm.
what's the problem organizations have after they buy some of that? It's integrating it and governing it and making the data actually accessible. Being able to say to the CEO, actually, we've just spent 10 million on our data platform. Here are the results, and here's how we're doing our
Yeah.
job properly. That's what everyone's doing. They're all building exactly the same infrastructure. So that is essentially what Orchestra is.
And so, okay, so you're helping businesses remove that silo as well. So, because I'm assuming all of these tools here are working in isolation, they're all working in silo, and then you're effectively orchestrating. I see what you did there with the name. All of these tools to be able to enable cross communication and a better data repository
Yeah.
for them to query against. Is that ultimately the goal of what you're trying to achieve
Yeah,
here?
I mean, there's definitely an element of bringing out data silos, especially in an enterprise setting. Because if you imagine how the sort of human process might work, right? You might say, "Oh, we're doing all of these fantastic marketing initiatives, but I have no idea, if this podcast is actually worthwhile." So you go to your head of engineering
Mm.
and you say, "Hey, head of engineering, here's the question I want to answer." They then go to their other data engineers and they say, okay, well, where's the podcast data? Oh, it's on StreamYard. Okay, so then they try to pull data from StreamYard into your data warehouse. Then they go to the data warehousing team and they say, okay, we're trying to work out what the return is here. And then they build some models in a warehouse. And then finally you go to the analytics team who build a dashboard for you. And then that goes from the analytics team back to the head of analytics who speaks to you and he says, hey, is this what you wanted? And you're like, oh, this isn't quite what I wanted. And then, if you've got to go through that feedback loop a few times, you've got to go all the way around the
Hmm.
organization, which
Hmm.
which is because everything is broken up. So, um,
Interesting. Interesting.
yeah,
Okay. So you've got, I'm assuming that you're working with businesses then that have got very advanced data pipelines, they've got advanced data repositories, and they've been harvesting data and cultivating data for, well, every business is doing that anyway, ultimately. But regardless, they are aware of what their data repositories are and where they sit. But how about businesses that are going, I'm sat on this data and I think I can get value from it? How do they go
mm.
about exploring where that value can kind of start coming from and how they could effectively commercialize that?
Yeah. I mean, I think these types of businesses are more or less in the same camp. So if you take something like manufacturing as an example, everybody
Yeah.
knows there's an enormous amount of helpful data there, right? It's like imagine
Hmm.
you've got sensors on all of your machines. Having that in somewhere where it's actionable is obviously helpful because you can do things like fix machines faster, increase output, work out stock levels in various warehouses, which has a really tangible business impact. So I think people know that they have the data and they have an idea of what value it can bring. The difference
Hmm.
comes in the maturity of the systems they're using to bridge that gap. Um,
Okay.
So, I think oftentimes, there will be companies that have a lot of data, that probably also, have relatively mature data pipelines and data platform teams, but they're still sort of wondering what that value could be, right? And I think you often see this in, large financial institutions like banks, for example, right? They have some of the largest and most sophisticated data platform teams out there. But
Hmm.
probably if you ask somebody, like in the sort of leadership team, it's like, oh well, do you know all the value of your data? They will say, we know there's some, but we don't know what it is, right? It's sort of known
Yeah.
unknown.
Yes.
um,
Yeah. Absolutely. I've heard an example that was given before with a data company that we were working with, where they were doing some work for a large retailer, and what they
mm,
thought was one of their most profitable products, it wasn't until they were running numbers and crunching the data that actually they were making a loss on every product delivered.
mm,
So it was a trampoline, and what they
yeah,
thought was actually selling like hotcakes and they were doing really well on. Once you actually factor in every single step of the process, including the delivery process, because it's then a two-person delivery, because of obviously the size and the weight of the product. Once you factor all these in, there
mm,
was actually not even breaking even; it was then making a loss. So
yeah,
not only do they then get a really great commercial understanding of where their profitability is, but they're
yeah.
also going, where can we stop making losses and what do we stop hemorrhaging and money on
Right,
effectively as well.
right, exactly. And I think this is my point, right? That the two characteristics you mentioned, so having, relatively advanced data infrastructure or having invested a lot in it and knowing how to get value from your data, right? They're not necessarily, like they're not necessarily as related as you might think, right? Because in this
Mm-hmm.
case, it's like, we see tons of companies that have built very large monolithic structures. They've got loads of data pipelines, but they still don't know what they need to do to action the data, right? So obviously, if you have no pipelines, you're not going to be able to generate any insights. But it's not, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Um, and I think maybe just very quickly on Orchestra, something we do which is quite unique is, we essentially encourage people to think about data as a product. So rather than just
Mm-hmm.
give people a framework for building pipelines, which is just sequences of tasks, right? It's rather boring.
Mm-hmm.
um, for a given product will essentially fetch all the metadata around it, which means that, if you know that a given set of, like data is being used to power marketing, we'll be able to pull in things like how much that's costing you to build, like what the ROI is, like how much people are using that data set. Which means that if you're using Orchestra to basically build, manage, and govern your pipelines, you can sort of do what consultants do, right? Which is stack rank every single initiative in terms of how much people
Yeah.
are using it and how much it costs, and then say, well, the team has spent 80% of the time on this, but it's not very helpful, is it? So we should probably kill that. Which is,
Yeah.
it's like pretty unique, I think.
That was exactly the angle I was going to go down on my notes here, which is data as a product. And are you seeing many businesses shift to that as well? Do you feel that's still a very embryonic understanding from a lot of enterprise points of view, or do you feel people are starting to see the value in that, and as they start to look at the cost to serve and also and look at their own costs, especially with cost of living crisis and all of these things that are happening, and everyone's tightening their belts and reducing margins and things like that. So are you seeing
Mhm.
that shift at the moment, would you say?
Yeah, slowly, slowly. I mean, I think if you remember the example I gave around, when you have a sort of data request, right, and it goes through many different layers of the organization. In order for you to do data products really well, every single person at every single step has to get that right. So if you're sort of, in the C-suite and you want to build a new data product because you think it's a good idea, that's all well and
Mm-hmm.
good. But then when it comes to tracking it, when it comes to building the infrastructure that allows you to think of data as a product, right? Even data modeling is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you don't model
Mm-hmm.
the data properly, it's actually quite hard to work out, what parts of the model ought to fit into this product or that product. Like is it a shared data model? Is it siloed? Right. It's like these are all like quite technical considerations, or rather, there are
Yeah.
technical
Implications.
implications from thinking of
Yeah,
data
I know
as a
what you're trying to
product,
say. Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So being a sort of infrastructure product that Orchestra is, we're obviously in there at every level. So we try to, but I think if your organization views not thinking of data as a product as a problem, it's that's very much a human and a culture thing in my eyes.
And so, at what point do businesses typically then get involved with you, and when do they go, we need Hugo's expertise here, this is where we really need to work with these
Yeah.
kind of people? What is the main problems that you find customers and prospects are facing?
Yeah, it's always one of scale, right? So if you're a small organization, and you're only running a handful of data pipelines, and people are leveraging the data in a fairly minimal way, right? So an example would be, CEO wants to know how much usage they're getting from their product, right? Or how much,
Mm-hmm.
what are sales, right? Just tell me what sales are, right? They might check that every week, which means that if your stuff fails in the middle of the week, you're not getting fired because you can just fix it manually and nobody ever notices. Um, right? Like, and it's not best
Yeah,
practice, right?
I'm wondering who's getting fired that quick, but I get your point. I get your point.
but like
Yeah.
it's like if people are using data to do things which are mission critical, which they absolutely should be, because it helps you become so much more markedly efficient, then there is actually quite a lot at stake. And it's the difference between data engineering and software engineering at the moment, right? It's like if a software engineer makes a mistake, then everybody around the world gets a blue screen of death, right? If a data engineer makes a mistake,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and that's obviously a crazy example, right? But a lot of the time, folks find themselves building data infrastructure, doing it for internal use cases, right? And typically that means the the implications of screwing up are not as high. And now, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
there are companies that don't operate that way, right? Facebook, Google, Meta, all the FANG companies are a very good example where data engineering, from like a human perspective, is basically treated as software engineering. But to my point earlier, it's like, when do people need orchestration? They need orchestration when they really, really, really need to build resilient systems and start to scale things, right? It's like, if you want to have any hope of getting a lot of value from data and AI, you have to do it en masse, so the thing has to scale and it has to be resilient. And for it to be resilient, you need some kind of infrastructure to stitch together and monitor all the other bits. So yeah, always a level of scale.
So when people build out data as a product, then go kind of backpedaling, but kind of coming back to your point that you've just made, when you consider things like Cambridge Analytica and the major, they had a data repository, they were seen as very forward thinking and very innovative internally, but externally the world wasn't ready for that. Do you feel that there are some hesitations around people really going into the untapped potential of their data repositories and what they could actually look at doing
Yeah,
because of stories like that have hit the media?
in many ways, right? In terms of harvesting social data to influence social things, they were probably ahead of their time. Um, at least if you compare them to somebody like, um, well, I don't know. It's always tricky when you get into elections. But if you look at how Facebook do it, for example, they probably have the same, if not greater, influence. But nobody kicks up a fuss about that, and they never have done, even though they probably should do. But I think the
Mm-hmm.
more interesting thing here is the distinction between, like data products and thinking about data as a product. So, a data product is when you take your data and you sell it to someone else. At least that's my
Yeah.
definition, right? So,
Yep.
in the
Mm-hmm.
financial world, like your Moody's, your S&P, right? It's like, you want to know what the prices were for this stock for the last 20 years? I'll sell it to you, right? That's a data product.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of organizations should stay away from that because it's just not their core business, right? And it's also oftentimes, right, not ethical, right? It's not your data to sell.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. In terms of thinking about data as a product, I think this is just a relatively new thing, right? Because if you sort of try to draw another comparison to things like software engineering, it's like, well, it's obvious what the product is, right? If you're a software engineer, you're building something like an application or a piece of hardware or whatever, and
Yep.
that has SLAs because it has customers and it has product managers and it has a P&L, right? It's like, we're
Yep.
missing a lot of that infrastructure and data. So, I don't think the Cambridge Analytica example sort of has any bearing on how people think about data as a product. I think it's just something which is, just relatively newer, and oftentimes not as necessary, right? It's like, you don't need to have a super strict SLA if you're a small business and you're just powering a dashboard that gets refreshed once a week, right?
Yeah.
It's okay to say that these things aren't mission critical, but at scale, and when there's lots of more more dollars on the line, it arguably should be, which I think is why it's getting a bit of traction now. But yeah, that's how
Okay,
I
so
view that.
okay, so future gazing then, what what do you think is next on the roadmap for businesses with data, and where does the limitation stop? Because like you said, we've got AI, we've got generative AI, and we've got large language models that are understanding more and more of our human interactions and being able to build more and more sophisticated outputs. What do you think could be the future for data as a whole, and how businesses are able to commercialize their data or interrogate their data or observe their data in order to be able to improve their own operations from that point of view?
That's a good question. I think, you know, when it comes to investing in any technology, there's always a cycle. So it
Mm-hmm.
becomes very interesting because of what people think is possible, and then people start to adopt it, and then they start to critique it. And I think there are many examples in industry where people have understood instantly how data is valuable, and
Mm-hmm.
they're making great waves on that. So, for example, if you are a hedge fund, right, you get that having a real time data pipeline with machine learning models on top can help you make an inordinate amount of money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a somewhat sad example, right, because there's no obvious social tie to it.
Yep.
And AI is sort of like the sort of an extra bit to that evaluation, right? Because now, in addition to all the stuff we knew, and oh well, now we can put an LLM on top. What does that unlock? So I think it's really industry specific. I think there are some really, really, really interesting things that are yet to be done in areas like healthcare, for example, particularly
Yep.
where there's, because, for example, being able to easily identify, diseases before they are identifiable by standard means is like a big deal, and that's really interesting. Um, Tied to that and tied to LLMs are unstructured data use cases. So unstructured data is basically anything that's not tabular, right? So anything that's not in a Google sheet,
Mm-hmm.
basically, you could define it that way. Um, and when it comes to sort of analyzing video and analyzing images and creating, analyzing speech, right? That stuff is really, really, really interesting. But I think maybe to leave the question with an analogy, sometimes when you see just like a piece of technology and you're like, God, that's weird. How did it do that? Right? Like when you're on your phone,
Mm-hmm.
and then suddenly you start
Mm-hmm.
getting ads for something that you were just speaking about with, a friend.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are going to be a lot more moments like that, basically,
Yep.
for better,
Yep.
or for worse.
For
Um,
better or for, and I think that's, to be honest, that's where I was going with the Cambridge Analytica question. There was more, do you see that evolving in the future where we as humans are spooked by the output of what can be done by data? I think that's more the angle that I was initially thinking we were going to go down. Obviously we took a slightly different angle, which is great, but that's more where I thought we were going to go with that. So it is interesting that you even see that going into the future, that is, there could be moments like that that could still spook us, and we're not quite ready for it. I've heard an example of when Channel 4 has been with 4OD, I think they call it 4OD, or they call it More 4, I'm not sure what More 4 maybe, but anyway, their on-demand service, because you have to log in to be able to watch the service and consume the content. They know your name, they've got your account details, and now ads are being trialed where they call out people's names in the middle of the ad and things like that, with dubbing that's done over the top. So it's very clever, but are we actually ready for that? Are people spooked by
yeah,
that? How do you
yeah,
orchestrate all of that to, you can orchestrate the data and get the output, but is anyone thinking about orchestrating the feedback and people's concerns, or how that's actually going to land in these types of things as well?
yeah,
So
yeah. No, I mean, very, very important. Very important. It's also, not a sort of not an area that we typically tend to play in, just mainly
no, of
because
course.
like if you're building like a system like that, right? It requires an enormous amount of technical input, and people will typically build it themselves, right? So use the example of Channel 4, but who else is doing that? Probably Netflix, right? What do Netflix have? They have hundreds of the smartest engineers in the world, right? They will build it themselves, and as a result,
Hmm.
it's like that's not sort of our target market. We're more
Hmm.
focused on businesses that are, you know, more in the sort of business of providing, like services, right? So like manufacturing, logistics, healthcare, stuff like that. But then obviously we have a whole host of other digital native companies. But then again, those tech companies are not normally like streaming giants, right?
Yeah,
Because there are
yeah,
a
yeah.
few of those. Again, sort of.
There are,
I
yeah,
know.
absolutely. I think more as a future gazing and as an example of what the world is kind of shifting into. The
Mm,
possibilities of data are truly unlimited. You're only really limited by your imagination or what a large language model comes up with as a possible thing to try. Because
yeah.
obviously we're humans and we can only think so much, but apparently we're now going to have computers thinking for us. So I think it's
Yeah.
quite an interesting interesting view to take. So
Dude.
from your point of view, I always like to ask this question towards the end. So this podcast is watched and listened to not just by people who are in business and they're looking to make a change, but also people who run their own businesses, entrepreneurs, and people who are investing in other businesses and things like that. So typically, then, based on those people who are listening to our podcast, what advice would you give to people who are looking to start out in business, start their own kind of ventures? Maybe they're inspired, like you were, by the industries and the fields that they've been working in, and going, actually, I can do something bigger and better than what I'm working with. What would be your advice be, and where do they start?
Yeah, I mean, I think having a motivation for starting a business that's, pure and founded on personal experience always helps. Every time, because, you will be the person that sells the business to whoever you are speaking to, right? Be it a customer, investor, or whatever. So you have to have that story, right? You have to believe it. The best way to do that is to do something you believe in. It sounds ridiculous, right? But there are a lot of people that work in consultancies that kind of just start businesses for the hell of it, right? That's not that's
Yeah,
not that's not me. Um, and then I think the other angle is, right, you just have to do it. Like you can sort of have an idea and wait about it for 6 months, but you just have to commit.
yeah,
Um,
the
so yeah,
hardest thing.
it's probably the best thing I could say. Just commit. If you're going to do it.
Brilliant. Love that. Love that. Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, Hugo. I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us on the podcast today. It's been really insightful and really interesting having this conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing the comments and the feedback that we're going to get off the back of this podcast. So thank you very much for your time. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you,
Yep.
everyone, also who has joined us on this podcast as well. And we look forward to welcoming you next time. So from Hugo and I, it's bye for now.